We concluded our last video saying that the audience of First Peter is converted Gentiles who seem to be experiencing some kind of persecution. And so what we're going to do in this video is get out there the kind of persecution that the audience of First Peter was likely facing. And this kind of persecution is going to sort of spread out to other New Testament texts as well as to persecution sort of outside or beyond the time period when the New Testament was written in the first 2 or 3 centuries of the Common Era. So we're dealing with our second objective here, explain in a few sentences the kind of suffering that the audience of First Peter likely faced. So we're dealing with the text of First Peter, and we're dealing specifically with its historical context of persecution or suffering. So first we want to establish that there is some kind of persecution happening according to Peter in First Peter. And we get this sense from a couple different passages. And as you sort of read the entirety of First Peter with the idea of persecution in mind, you'll see it sort of underlying more than just these 3 passages, but it really comes out in these different places. So First Peter 1:6, in this you rejoice, even if now for a little while you've had to suffer various trials. So, of course, suffer various trials is our key words here. But also notice that the author of First Peter assumes that the suffering is temporary. There's going to be sort of an end to it at some point. And then 1 Peter 4:12 through 14, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you to test you. So the purpose of suffering is testing, as though something strange were happening to you. So 1 Peter 4 says, you can sort of expect some kind of suffering to happen. But rejoice insofar as you are sharing Christ's sufferings. So there's this sense in which the suffering is, we already have a model for suffering in Jesus Christ that the audience of First Peter is to look to for their own sufferings, so that you may also be glad and shout for joy when his glory is revealed. If you are reviled for the name of Christ, you are blessed. So suffering in a way for 1 Peter 4 is a good thing. It reflects the fact that that the audience is sort of following the model of the founder of the Jesus movement, namely Jesus himself, because the Spirit of glory, which is the Spirit of God, is resting upon you. And then lastly, 1 Peter 5:9 through 10, resist him, steadfast in your faith, for you know that your brothers and sisters in all the world are undergoing the same kinds of suffering. And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, support, strengthen, and establish you. So 2 things I want to call attention to here is that the author of 1 Peter assumes sort of a universal suffering of the early church. And then also, once again, the author assumes that that suffering is temporary insofar as God is going to act in history and put an end to it. And so we move from establishing the fact that there's some kind of suffering, and the author of 1 Peter seems to think of it as widespread throughout the ancient Christian world, to what kind of suffering we might have in 1 Peter. So what I want you to do here is briefly pause and read the selection from Tacitus right here. I'm not going to read it out loud because it's a bit long, but read it, and then once you're done, unpause and I'll make some comments about it. So what we have going on here, and this is not mentioned in the text itself, is Nero placing blame for a great fire in Rome that destroyed a large swath of the city on to Christians. So Christians are blamed for a specific act and a specific deed, and in Rome they are punished. But Tacitus also alludes to the fact that Christianity starts out in Judea and then spreads to Rome. But in this case, it's not that the suffering or persecution isn't necessarily happening everywhere, wherever Christianity is. But at this point, it is specifically Nero blaming Christians for a certain act and punishing them accordingly. So the punishment or the suffering or the persecution is happening in a specific location, in a specific city in 64 CE. It is not a sort of official proclamation that Christianity universally and Christians universally ought to be punished or persecuted or put to death for their beliefs. It's the result of a specific action in a specific place in Tacitus's annals. So moving to another longer text, and once again, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and pause and read this, and you're also going to answer a question here. I apologize that the text is a little bit small, but hopefully you can still read it here. What I want you to do in this case is read Pliny's letter to the Emperor Trajan. So Pliny is an authority figure, again, in a specific locale, writing to the emperor of the Roman Empire at large. And as you read through this, for the course notes, for the lecture pause for this lecture, I want you to just make bullet point notes about what you notice about the letter, what you notice about maybe the nature of the suffering or the persecution, what sort of just anything that comes to mind. This doesn't have to be eloquent, just sort of brain vomit anything that comes to your mind in bullet point format as you read this text here. So I'm going to make a few comments about Pliny's text here before we look at Trajan's response to Pliny. So I want you to notice a few things here. First, at the beginning of the text, Pliny states that he doesn't really know what to do. He hasn't had experiences with the trials of Christians before. And what this suggests is that sort of the trial of Christians is not this widespread phenomenon at the beginning of the 2nd century CE, but because Pliny's not aware of what to do. The trials are happening, but they're not so widespread that Pliny has observed them or been a part of them yet. He also says that he doesn't really understand or know the Christian beliefs. He doesn't really get what's going on with them, but he does recognize that there's some problem with emperor worship. The fact that the Christians will not worship Trajan, and when they do, when a person sort of recants and will worship the emperor, then the issue is settled. There's no need to punish Christians or no need to do anything further because they have repented of their Christian belief and done what they need to do with respect to worship of the Roman emperor. And that seems to be really the issue at hand here, is that Christians are not participating in things like the imperial cult or the worship of the polytheistic gods in a world wherein it's understood that worshiping the gods and making sacrifices to them curries favors not only on individuals but also on collective societies. The problem with Christians for Pliny and Trajan is that if they're not doing that, they could be irking the gods in some ways that makes the gods punish a city or a society or an entire empire. And then so on further sort of investigation, sort of at the end of the letter, Pliny states on 2 different occasions that Christianity is this superstition. So we have this in the ancient world, in the Roman Empire, we sort of have this division between what is superstitio, what is superstition, and what is religio, sort of religion proper, the right worship of the gods. And Pliny says what the Christians are doing is just this, it's just this superstitious stuff. That doesn't mean that it's wholly innocent. It's a problem because it is not proper religion. It's not proper currying favor of the Roman gods. And then at the very end of the letter, Pliny says, I think we can get things under control. I think we can handle this and we can get back to business as usual. People going back into the temples, making sacrifices, and things really working out. So we're lucky enough to have a response to Pliny's letter from Trajan himself. And notice here, we'll go ahead and pause the lecture really quick and go ahead and read what Trajan has to say. And what we find here is that Trajan says we can't lay down a general and universal principle of how to deal with Christians, for it is not possible to lay down any general rule to serve as a kind of fixed standard. So we have to sort of deal with Christians in an ad hoc manner. And what all this suggests is that there's not really a state-sponsored or universal nature to the persecution in the period following, or probably in the period also of or when First Peter was written. There's not a sort of top-down order from the emperor saying all Christians need to be persecuted, all Christians need to be executed, this movement needs to be squashed altogether. Rather, it's if Christians are causing problems in a certain area, then they need to be checked, and they need to make sure they're doing things to sort of make sure the empire runs as usual. And what seems to be going on in First Peter is that First Peter has this bit in 1 Peter chapter 2, and we'll go ahead and read it. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme or of governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. For it's God's will that by doing right you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet don't use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, and then very critically here, honor the emperor. First Peter, of course, does not say worship the emperor, but what First Peter seems to be communicating is that you can expect suffering and persecution if you do not participate in the idolatry of the polytheistic religion. If you don't worship the emperor, based on your Christian beliefs, based on your worship of Jesus and the Jewish God, you can expect suffering and persecution to come, but you sort of shouldn't seek it out. You shouldn't flaunt your freedom. You shouldn't necessarily do things just to irk the ire of leaders, but rather you should act in such a way to show that Christianity, to show that this early movement sort of works within the culture as it stands to an extent, and that there is sort of a line drawn in the sand at who and what one worships in First Peter. That suffering will happen because you're going to cross that line. You're not you aren't going to do the idolatrous acts as a Christian. You're not going to worship the Roman gods. You're not going to worship the emperor. But at the same time, you should do everything else you can to show that this movement sort of can work within the established norms up to the point of what would be considered idolatry by early Christians, and would be considered idolatry by modern Christians, by us today as well.